Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Elizabeth Pena, and as Interim Dean and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Graduate Theological Union, I'm so pleased to welcome you to this year's Borsch-Rast lecture. Since today is Earth Day, it's particularly important to acknowledge that the Graduate Theological Union stands on the land of the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, successors of the Verona Band in the territory of Huchun. This land continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people and other descendants. We are gathered here today to honor awardee Dr. Devin Zuber, whose book, A Language of Things, Emanuel Swedenborg and the American Environmental Imagination, makes an appropriate subject for Earth Day. The Borsch-Rast Book Prize of $10,000 is awarded annually to a GTU graduate or current faculty member whose published book provides new perspectives on a theological or religious issue through creative and innovative scholarship. The prize is funded by an endowment stemming from the sale of Trinity Press International, a venture created and operated by Frederick Borsch and Harold Rast, who were concerned about a decline in works of serious theology. At Trinity Press, they could publish books on religion that were scholarly and interdisciplinary, as well as works that were considered provocative by denominational publishing houses. We are honored to remember Bishop Frederick Borsch and the Reverend Harold Rast with the Borsch-Rast Book Prize and Lecture. The Borsch-Rast Book Prize selection panel is a very exclusive book club consisting of 4 distinguished former GTU deans. So thank you to Deans Judith Burling, Arthur Holder, Uriah Kim, and Margaret Miles. This is the 4th Borsch-Rast Prize, but only the 3rd lecture. Last year's event fell victim to COVID-19. So we missed hearing from Dr. Virginia Burris, whose book, Ancient Christian Ecopoetics, Cosmologies, Saints, Things, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018. Dr. Burris is the Bishop W. Earl Ledden Professor of Religion at Syracuse University, and in 2017 was GTU's Alumna of the Year. So congratulations, belated congratulations to Dr. Burris, and I'm very sorry that we had a global pandemic. I would also like to recognize the 2 authors whose impressive books were awarded honorable mentions this year. Jerome P. Baggett, who received his PhD from the GTU in 1997, is a professor of religion and society at the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University and a GTU core doctoral faculty member. In his book, The Varieties of Non-Religious Experience, Atheism in American Culture, from NYU Press, Dr. Baggett provides a fresh perspective about American atheists, upending negative stereotypes to explore atheists' views on morality and meaning. Joseph A. Marshall, a 2005 GTU PhD graduate, is professor of religious studies at Ball State University. His book, Appalling Bodies, Queer Figures Before and After Paul's Letters, from Oxford University Press, provides new insights into biblical interpretation by using queer theory to help connect the marginalized and stigmatized figures in Paul's letters to others from both before and after. So congratulations to Dr. Baggett and Dr. Marshall. But tonight we are here to recognize my colleague and my friend, Dr. Devin Zuber, GTU Associate Professor of American Studies, Religion, and Literature, affiliated with the Center for Swedenborgian Studies. Dr. Zuber also serves as chair of the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies of Religion. Dr. Zuber received his PhD in English literature in 2010 from the Graduate Center, City University of New York. Since then, he has held fellowships and residencies at multiple prestigious institutions, including the Department of Aesthetics and Culture at Stockholm University, the Rachel Carson Center for the Environment at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, and at the former Ingmar Bergman Estate on Faroe Island, Sweden. Dr. Zuber will be visiting professor of religion and literature at Humboldt University of Berlin in spring 2022. Several of Dr. Zuber's current projects are in collaboration with performance artist Marina Abramovich, exploring the spiritual qualities of her work. With GTU colleague Dr. Thomas Kotoy, Dr. Zuber is working on a book entitled Performing Transcendence, Marina Abramovich and Religion. Dr. Zuber is also working on a compilation of interviews related to an upcoming Abramovich performance to take place at the Royal Academy in London. Dr. Zuber's prize-winning book, A Language of Things, Emanuel Swedenborg and the American Environmental Imagination, was published by the University of Virginia Press in 2019. To describe the book, I'll quote Dr. Judith Berling, one of the deans on the selection committee who also holds the title of GTU Professor Emerita of Chinese and Comparative Religions. Dr. Berling said, "A Language of Things is an interdisciplinary tour de force, interweaving art, literature, science, and intellectual history to shed light on a little-known strand of the American environmental imagination." At a time when we are questioning the adequacy of dominant historical narratives, Zuber demonstrates how the thought and imagination of Emanuel Swedenborg, often considered a non-mainstream figure, influenced and interacted with many threads of European and American intellectual history. He reminds us that there are nuances and strands of history, alternative narratives, that can enhance our ability to see our present and imagine our future. Tonight, we had planned for Dr. Zuber to be in conversation with two illustrious interlocutors, and that is still the case. However, I'm sorry to say that Dr. Timothy Morton, Rita Shea Guffey Chair in English at Rice University, was unable to join us at the last minute. But to our rescue comes Dr. Zuber's dissertation advisor, Dr. Joan Richardson, Distinguished Professor in English, Comparative Literature, and American Studies at the Graduate Center, CUNY. Dr. Richardson has written extensively on poet Wallace Stevens and published several important books on pragmatism. In line with her interest in philosophy, natural history, and science, Dr. Richardson's current work is a spiritual autobiography entitled Images, Shadows of Divine Things. And we are delighted to welcome Dr. Niklaus Largier, who is the Sidney and Margaret Anker Professor of German and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Largier's work is broad-ranging, including medieval literature, the history of the senses and the production of sense experience, and the history of imagination and the emotions. His current projects are about imagination, figuration, and notions of possibility, and a book on the history of practices and the poetics of prayer. Finally, I'm so pleased to turn things over to moderator Dr. Rita Sherma, who is the director of the GTU Center for Dharma Studies and co-creator, along with Dr. Zuber, of the Sustainability 360 Initiative, an incubator for cutting-edge research and projects that operate at the intersection of sustainability studies and religion within pluralist, multi-religious, and intersectional contexts. Dr. Sherma and Dr. Zuber discussed this work in a newly released GTUX original, Greening Spirituality. Please see the GTU website for information on how to access this new video series. So, Dr. Sherma.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pena. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here on this wonderful occasion. And I want to congratulate my friend and colleague, Dr. Devin Zuber, for this remarkable book. I will just read to you very briefly one small but important note from one of his endorsements, and he has received many. And the endorsement is actually from Reverend Nate Klug. And he says, in A Language of Things, Devin Zuber offers a critical attempt to restore the fundamental role that religious experience could play in shaping 19th century American approaches to natural space by tracing the ways that Ralph Waldo Emerson, John Muir, and others variously responded to Swedenborg. Zuber illuminates the complex dynamic that came to unfold between the religious, the literary, and the ecological. A language of things situates this dynamic within some of the new materialisms of recent environmental thought, showing how these earlier authors anticipate present concerns with the other than human in the Anthropocene. I welcome Dr. Zuber now. Devin, you have the floor.
Thanks, Rita. Thanks, everyone, for coming tonight. I know, especially for you East Coasters or beyond, it's late after a long day of Zooming and meetings. So I am very humbled by your presence here tonight. And I'm very grateful for Niklaus Largier and Joan Richardson that they are here to be in dialogue with me about the project. In various ways, to one degree or another, this book comes out of conversations that I had with Joan when I was in graduate school that led me down the rabbit hole of pursuing Swedenborg's diffuse presence in 19th century American culture. Or, even though I didn't yet know Niklaus, I was aware of his work on mysticism and the place of mysticism in aesthetic experience that was very important in the final stages of writing that project. So it feels like a full circle is being able to be drawn by having those two particular people here tonight. So I'm going to say a few words I've prepared with some images to sort of set the stage. I'll talk for maybe 15 minutes, hopefully not much longer, and then we'll turn over to Niklaus and then Joan to offer some responses, and then we'll have a larger, more plenary forum, which my colleague and friend, Dr. Rita Sherma, will be facilitating. So let me go to share screen. I really hate Zoom, but the good thing about it is that I can be in dialogue with people all over. Thanks for being here, and let me just go here. Okay, hopefully all of you can see this. For those of you who are from the Bay Area or know Northern California, the image on the cover of this book is of the San Francisco Bay, which is a sheer coincidence. It's what the designers of the book chose. It's Mount Tamalpais across the bay. So it's Earth Day, of course, a token day of appreciation to our swiftly tilting planet, a holiday whose inception is caught up in the effective response to the image of the blue marble Earth that circulated in 1972 and became instrumental and iconic for environmental justice struggles in the 1970s. Earth Day is thus a kind of art day where we can recall the ability of the aesthetic to augment broader public conversations and the political, to offer new ways of imagining the world and our place in it. But not to view this world with rose-colored glasses in 2021. Let's be honest about where we stand some 51 years after the first Earth Day was commemorated. Here in California today, Governor Gavin Newsom announced the declaration of major drought emergencies in counties across the state, including Sonoma, just north of me here in Berkeley, which is unprecedented in year after year of amplifying wildfire effects caused by climate change. We overstate the word historic, Newsom said today at a press conference, but this is indeed a historic moment. Yet the unprecedented has become almost commonplace to anyone who has lived through the past few years here. From 2018's lethal wildfires in Paradise to that strangest of days only last year when the dome of wildfire smoke was so thick above the bay that it turned San Francisco into an orange, hazy simulacrum of the Blade Runner film franchise. This is not my picture. This is grabbed from Google. It's so apocalyptic, everyone seemed to say on that day, if you were in the Bay, and the commonplaceness of that expression underscored the persistent ways we continue to cast environmental and planetary collapse in explicitly theological terms, even in the most secular of contexts. This is perhaps the most acute hubris of the Anthropocene, if that is the term we want to use to describe our new man-made geological era we are cascading the planet into. Apocalypse, in its etymological and religious roots, of course, is not so much the penultimate end times, but the revelation of things as they are, the uncovering, a revelatory revealing of things as they actually are. So much of our contemporary environmental rhetoric remains committed to this kind of apocalyptics, a scientific info dump of data that we bury our heads in the sand to avoid cognizing and confronting. Rising water levels, shrinking glaciers, increased temperatures, deforestation, the sixth great extinction of species, so on and so forth. We all have our own litanies of facts and figures to recite when we think of this. We must not flinch away from the ethics of seeing what our species has done and is continuing to wreak on the planet in the name of development and free markets and progress. But is tallying all this information enough? The fact that 51 years after Earth Day's inception, that we are planetarily worse off in many ways than we were decades ago should signal an attenuation of the efficacy of all this data on its own to augment and change opinion in the public sphere. We have continued under a kind of delusion that all we have needed is more rational inputs, the amplification of more scary facts to jolt collective common sense into action. In this public sphere of opinions and legal regimes, since the Enlightenment, religion has tended to be sidelined in the conversation, privatized and interiorized, or allowed to engage only under certain constraints, that it be well-behaved, reasonable, not overly emotional, and function as a force of disciplinary self-regulation. Science was notably on display today during congressional hearings held via Zoom about fossil fuel subsidies and the current Biden infrastructure plan. Facing Congress, the young Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg was eloquent and crystal clear, as she so often is. This is a now or never moment that far transcends the particularities of the Biden administration and will have consequences for generations of children to come. Listen to the scientists, pleaded Greta once again. If our present is so fraught with consequences, how do we understand the past that brought us to this precipice? Perhaps the moment of the Anthropocene even undoes the very idea of history itself. This is the contention of the Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, known to many of us here, who argues that we now carry a kind of geological force as an entity capable of self and planetary annihilation. This lethalness undoes the foundational epistemes of history writing as a field of meaning making, where humanity's self-agency has occupied center stage. The geos, the deep time of the earth, the millennial evolution of our species, is now crosshatched into the history of the human. In my book, A Language of Things, I return to the not so well-known figure of another Swede, no relation to Greta, Emanuel Swedenborg, who lived between 1688 and 1772, to investigate some paths not taken by modernity and to recover several moments in the emergence of environmental consciousness in a North American context that complicate the narrative, the normative narrative about science and the secular. My book is, I hope, less a history of influence. For sticking only with questions of influence keeps us bound to notions of progress and the telos of a civilizing march of ideas, forwards ho, and is more of an attempt to rethink paths less traveled by way of insights provided by contemporary thinking in what we sometimes call loosely the new materialisms. Swedenborg's visionary theology, I argue, came to operate as an agent of re-enchantment for a group of American authors and artists who were associated with the appearance of an environmental imagination in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This translator of nature into thought, as Ralph Waldo Emerson put it, is a forgotten vital source for a current of proto-ecological ideas that streamed out of Concord transcendentalism into the broader rippling circles of conservation and preservation that mark the emergence of both modern American environmentalism in a political sense and forms of non-institutional dark green nature religion and spirituality. And by dark green nature spirituality there, I'm tagging the work of Ron Taylor. But and this is a very, very big but in my book, I hope, Swedenborg's legacy is also embedded within attempts to discern the Anthropocene. His career as a leading Scandinavian natural scientist led to formative contributions in geology, crystallography, and mineralogy. The practical implications of this work, summarized in his mechanistic magnum opus, the Opera Philosophica et Mineralia, led to innovations in smelting technology and the extraction of metal ores from the earth. James Watt, inventor of the steam engine in the 1760s, the machine that veritably generated the Industrial Revolution, was but one of several savants who adapted and used this material from Swedenborg's Principia. Isaac Watt's steam engine has been cited as a harbinger marking the advent of the Anthropocene and our carbon-based civilization and economies. Swedenborg, thus, stands not only as a natural philosopher of the Enlightenment, whose ideas are constitutive to modernity's mechanism, but as a mystic, he also stands as the creator of an organicist theosophy that imbued later forms of romantic ecology that were resistant to that very industrial revolution. Some of these paradoxes and oxymorons in Swedenborg are found in his later readers, and my book opens and closes with Johnny Appleseed and his recent invocations in fiction by Richard Powers in The Overstory, and in the graphic novel by Noah Van Scriver and Paul Bula, which is pictured here. Towards the end of the 18th century, John Chapman, better known as Johnny Appleseed, began his westward peregrination towards the Mississippi through the still then frontier of the Ohio River Valley. A committed pacifist, a vegetarian, dressed in motley homespun rags, reputedly walking through the rough woods in his bare feet, Appleseed came to be revered by local Native Americans as a medicine man of great power. And of course, as many of you know, in addition to leaving behind his namesake seeds, he also distributed torn out pages of Swedenborg's writings that he claimed were good news right fresh from heaven. In this earliest visual representation of Appleseed known to exist, a drawing from an 1862 history of Midwestern pioneers, Chapman stands barefoot in the woods, his left hand cradling a young apple seedling. Tucked into his homespun overalls, a large, bulky book peeks above the waistline. Seemingly incongruous with the rustic character of everything else in the image that is supposed to denote a frontier or wilderness context. This book is lightly meant to signify one of Chapman's beloved Swedenborg volumes, already by this point an indelible part of the growing Appleseed legend. As the writer Michael Pollan puts it, Appleseed's mystical teachings, quote, veer about as close to pantheism and nature worship as American Christianity has dared to venture, end quote. So my book is an attempt to trace a set of ideas that Appleseed and then others, such as Emerson, Thoreau, John Muir, encountered in Swedenborg, which I argue resonate with certain strands of the so-called new materialisms that are much afoot in contemporary philosophy and the environmental humanities today. The immanental influxes and flows of energy and divine love that animated the landscape, seen through a Swedenborgian scrim, lent an agency and animacy to nature, and the other than human world came to glow with a kind of numinousness, producing strange affects of wonder and awe. While this could lend itself to privileging a sight of individualized, spiritualized perception, we might think here of the iconic moment in Ralph Waldo Emerson's inaugural Nature, where he becomes a transparent eyeball on the Boston Commons, part or particle of God, a moment that is infamously satirized by his friend Christopher Peirce Cranch, pictured here in this funny sketch. It could also form shared imaginaries about places and spaces that led to critical legal interventions on behalf of an imperiled nature. We find this acutely in the entanglement of Swedenborgian ideas around the emergence of the Sierra Club in the 1890s, perhaps the first, for better and for worse, modern environmental organization in the United States. Pictured here is John Muir's annotations to a Swedenborgian text about the spiritual semiotics of the natural world, a desire to grasp a language of things and not of man. John Muir's close friend, the Swedenborgian landscape painter William Keith, in whose painting studio the Sierra Club had some of its first meetings, painted the so-called wilderness of California in his canvases in a way that was analogous to Muir's wilderness prose, imbuing the landscape with spiritual revelation and a numinousness. This painting by William Keith was one of several that John Muir displayed in the United States Capitol building during congressional hearings about the Hetch Hetchy Valley, whether that spectacular place was to be dammed up for its water to quench the thirst of a very thirsty and growing San Francisco, or to keep it as part of the national park system in Yosemite. The valley was ultimately condemned and dammed, of course, through the Riker Act, and the failure of these spiritual landscapes to adequately testify before Congress perhaps indicts the inefficacy of arguments about beauty in our environmental politics. We are not to save the planet by beautifying it. In fact, if you know the history of the Riker trial, and I talk a little bit about this in my Muir and Keith chapter, Republican senators from Utah and Nevada who saw these canvases saw this actually as an advertisement for increasing the flow of water so there could be boating tourism and commerce and industry. These paintings and Muir's ecstatic prose that extolled the wilderness of Hetch Hetchy and Yosemite, beautiful as many still find them today, also exhibit a serious ideological blind spot, an inability, literally, to envision the lives of indigenous peoples who had called these areas home for millennia. When Muir traipsed into the Yosemite area for the first time, a trip later recounted in his environmental classic, My First Summer in the Sierra, he felt he had discovered a lost Eden, a landscape that seemed to map the biblical garden and paradise so important for the Judeo-Christian tradition. Muir could not see the careful ways that the Miwok Awanichi had practiced prescribed burns and forest gardening there for generations. If it seemed like a paradise and a manicured lawn, it was because it was one, in a sense, carefully maintained. Instead, Muir's early encounters in the Sierra of indigenous persons followed the typical racism of his day. He couldn't see, he wrote, how they could possibly belong in the landscape. My book is thus, I hope, also an anatomy of some of the dangers that adhered to this romantic language of things that dilated out from Swedenborgian theology, how its spiritualizing vectors that sanctified the landscape could also cloak, and in some cases abet and construct, the genocidal violence of the colonial frontier. While these paintings and the early Sierra Club writings are important moments for understanding how cultural imaginaries could be augmented and changed by new spiritual attitudes towards the natural world, and part of a resistance towards seeing nature simply in terms of material extraction or as a dead and disenchanted world, a la Max Weber, they are also inevitably caught up in what W.J.T. Mitchell has called the dreamwork of imperialism in the images and aesthetics of the West. When we acknowledge this entanglement, what do we do in our contemporary moment in the 21st century when we find ourselves lured and beckoned by the beauty of the natural world? Well, my project is very much the province of literary history and eco-criticism. We might cite the oft-referenced data provided by the Pew Center on the growing demographic of the spiritual but not religious, the SBNR, and the so-called nuns, that's N-O-N-E-S, not nuns in the Catholic sense. People who might be disenchanted by organized religion, but still find a form of meaningful spiritual presence in their experiences outdoors in nature. Here along the beaches and mountains of Northern California, when we find ourselves immersed and transported by our setting, is this simply the helpless imposition of a cultural construct we are to be suspicious of or put scare quotes around? For a long time, aesthetic experience in the West has been a container for what was deemed impermissible by organized religion. Excessive states of ecstasy, wonder, sublime terror, the emotional extremities of mysticism. And it is no surprise that a heterodox liminal figure like Swedenborg found his most immediate reception not in the halls of traditional theology and religious establishments, but rather among a generation of young romantic artists and writers like the rebellious William Blake, who wanted to buck the deadening yoke of an Enlightenment rationalist project. With these European germinated ideas transplanted to an American soil, How do these spiritual technologies for seeing and ways of feeling navigate a continent so riven by slavery and settler colonial violence? Can we ascribe to nature anything like the spiritual, its panoramas and the picturesque, without some hedging disclaimer and sensitivity to the land and still very serious questions of appropriation? Perhaps. I'm hoping in the end that my book might diagram some lost opportunities and missed conversations and create a place for a kind of speculative historiography or contrapuntal what ifs. What would have happened if John Muir hadn't cavalierly dismissed the Mono-Paiute with casual racism or the Awanichi and actually sat down to learn from them about their plant wisdom and forest cultivation? It might have worked to undo the human versus culture dialectic that runs through what we call the trouble with wilderness in Muir and others' work. After all, the concept of the spiritual is not exclusively the domain of the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation and its post-secular reverberations into the present. Much contemporary indigenous art and cinematography is premised on a non-Western understanding of the land as alive and filled with agency and invisible spiritual presences. In closing, although I do not discuss this work in my book, I would like to supplement the spiritualized landscape paintings by William Keith and also George Innes, who I talk about in my book, with work by the contemporary artist Francisco Huichicuello. I want to give a shout out here to my brilliant former student, now Dr. Johanna Juncker, for introducing me to this material. It's another case of how my project was so enriched by the space of GTU and the conversations here in Berkeley on Holy Hill. Huichicuello is from the Mapuche, an indigenous group in Chile and Argentina that has faced horrible conditions under colonialism that continue, of course, up to the present day. His films and art often deliberately attempt to inculcate, in his words for the viewer, the spiritual instinct before reason. The forest, rivers, and landscapes that populate his films are haunted both by the horrors of colonial violence, but also ghostly energies and often fleeting moments of beauty, flowers that drift on the surface of water, figures dancing against the silhouette of a blue sky, figurations that bring a sense of hope in spite of all that is portrayed. So in conclusion, to wrap things up, if we are to continue translating Swedenborg's language of things out of its 18th and 19th century context into our contemporary moment of planetary crisis and climate change, my book wishes for ways this can be done in deeper and better dialogue with the visions and voices that come from the ground where his work was once sprinkled, like Johnny Appleseed's plant seeds. The end of my book closes with Appleseed articulating the following. I'm just going to read this final paragraph. Along the Ohio River Valley, one can still find apple trees that are reputed to descend from Appleseed's original plantings, flowering and bearing their sour cider apples 2 centuries later. Appleseed's ecological tomorrow ghosts are today. And perhaps somewhere out there in the weirder corners of Americana, the seeds of Swedenborg's immanental theology are continuing to crosshatch, maybe to sprout still stranger forms of eco-aesthetics for the Anthropocene, harbingers of an American nature that seems likely to remain, for many, numinous and vibrant. Thank you.
Yes, I guess it's my turn. Thank you, Devin, and thank you for having me here to talk about this book and respond and maybe bring some thoughts into the conversation. I want to say first, for me, who came to California 20 years ago, it was a stimulating reading in several ways. First, just because it gave me a way into an imagination of the California landscape particularly, and John Muir, that I wasn't familiar with except for kind of little fragments. So early on when I was in California, I was in Los Angeles and I visited the Swedenborgian church in Palos Verdes, which is absolutely wonderful, overlooking the ocean. and which resonates or resonated, but still resonates more with the sublime for me than actually with the beautiful. It's on that edge of the continent, overlooking the ocean, providing a really incredible experience. And Devin's book now created a series of connections for me that I found extremely stimulating and illuminating, and that will certainly accompany me when I travel through California or go up into the Sierras. You mentioned that dialogue, or you said dialogue several times now in speaking, and I noted also for myself, dialogue is really a hallmark of your style, also the way you present the materials. It's also a book that I see as deeply invested, not so much in a history of knowledge. It's not so much a history of the influence of Swedenborg on American imagination, on environmental imagination. It is deeply invested in what I would call the development, the formation of sensibilities. And I just want to point out kind of 4 lines. You already talked about the book, but I still, for the readers who haven't read the book yet. And it's on one side a genealogy of Swedenborg's thought, with an emphasis on what you call the language of things. And you lay out really beautifully how within Swedenborg's own biography this develops, and there too, in what contexts he moves from a more mechanicist view to a more organicist view of nature, to put it that, of the earth in the name of today's day. An organicist view, though, that is very deeply shaped by, and that's where your title is important, the language of things, by a certain kind of an understanding of the language of nature. It's also a book, and that's the second point that was important for me and that was already mentioned. It is in dialogue with the reception of Swedenborg's thought, but not so much in, as I just said, in terms of the influence that he had up to the Swedenborgian church in San Francisco, or up to John Muir, or up to the painter Keith, but more a kind of channeling this through observations of how these figures read Swedenborg, how they made use of him, and also how they transformed his thought. And then you mentioned that, and was mentioned before, it is a book that is in a deep dialogue with recent philosophical and eco-critical thought up to the problems we are facing today, and with ideas that bring, in often surprising ways in recent years, a new material in conversation with a new materialism in conversation with spiritual traditions, as we call them often nowadays, with religious traditions in their specific shapes that they got through the Swedenborgian intervention, so to speak. So you bring these elements that you draw from Swedenborg to the forefront of current theoretical and practical issues, and I'd really like to talk more about the practical side also later, in what we call nowadays discussions about the Anthropocene, or whatever is meant by that term. And then the fourth point for me, I mentioned it in an introductory way, the environmental imagination, particularly its place in the Bay Area and in California. What you show also is how this language of nature, and I don't go into detail with Swedenborg, when Swedenborg is always somewhat esoteric and hard to approach, but I think you do a great job in presenting him to us as a readable author. But what you foreground is really the intimate connection between the spirituality, the aesthetics, and the poetics. A conversation between these three areas that we sometimes divide up, and the mediating function of what could be called religious experience in this. So what I learned first is, and you use this as your own emblematic moment in the introduction, is the story of Johnny Appleseed that forms really the arc of your book. I didn't know about the fact that Johnny Appleseed or Chapman was actually, had anything to do with Swedenborg. What I also found really a strong element there is that you de-romanticize the story as I knew it, when I knew it as a kind of a romantic children's story. And when I say you de-romanticize it, you embed Swedenborg, and Joan can certainly talk more about that and knows much more than I about that. The Swedenborg reception, or how people read Swedenborg, gets embedded in the US or in the American discussions and conversation in what I would call a more pragmatist line of thought that then I have ever been familiar with in Europe. And that can be seen as a pragmatist line which leads into a certain aesthetic, but it also emphasizes what I would call a spiritual side of pragmatism, sometimes even approaching, you use the term at some point, the paranormal, panpsychic affinity of forms of pragmatist thought. And I'm not just thinking about the kind of the canonical pragmatist thinkers. I was also thinking about the descriptions of nature, for example, in certain scenes in Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, where nature, preaching, praying come into very intimate conversations. And what that foregrounds for me is how important social practices become in this book, and as social practices that produce collective aesthetic. And there I come back to the notion of sensibilities that changed and shaped American perception of nature. And when I talk about practices, when you know my work somewhat, I'm very much invested in reconstructing medieval contemplative practices, spiritual practices. What I was struck by is that other practices come into view here as forms of cultivation of sensibility, as I would call it, namely just looking, walking, hiking, forms of moving within the environment. That's one essential element that I learned, and that for me moved into the foreground. It certainly can be illustrated, or could be illustrated, with what you do with John Muir, but also with the other figures you discuss. Then another point I'd like to emphasize is that so you start with Swedenborg and you end, so to speak, with John Muir and California environmentalists. Emerson plays a very important role here. I mean, he is what seems to me the one who translates Swedenborg in ideas of microcosm, macrocosm correspondences, his notions of flux, influx, all these ideas which still retain, for me, it's a little bit like Jakob Böhme in the German tradition, an esoteric and complicated status. So Emerson is the one who translates this into a dynamic model of a different kind of knowledge. And I want to still keep the walking and hiking, etc., in the background as an element of this generation or formation of another kind of knowledge that moves on thresholds of human and non-human. And that seems to be at the center of your work and of your interest when you speak of Emerson's eco-poetics, which seems at the same time, and I use this technical term here, but I think it's justified, a Neoplatonic metaphysics of emanation, the divine that emanates through nature, that flows. All these metaphors play an important role, but then also a transformation of this into, and that's where materialism suddenly becomes also spiritually, I think, interesting or significant. It's this flow that in Emerson's writing transforms into the depths of what we could call a material world, an empirical world of experience. And I think that's where it's most prominently graspable, how the Swedenborgian esotericism, to call it that, translates into poetic form, which is not necessarily poetry. I think styles of writing, and I would like to add this to the practices of hiking and walking, play an important role here. And also for me, it has always been the form of the essay that is essential to Emerson as a way, or like a new place where correspondences are articulated, explored, and where they actually emerge in and through a new specific form of knowing the world. And what's fascinating about this for me is also that it is not so much in specific beliefs about the world, or not so much, you said that in your little short introduction before, it's not so much about a different knowledge or body of knowledge about the world, or objectifying body of knowledge about the world, but it is about forms of engagement, we could call it, forms of specific attention or awareness, which then also can be traced, and you do it wonderfully, through John Muir's writings, for example. When you point out the ambivalence and that inhabits these writings, and that's certainly something to keep in mind here, but you foreground how the form of writing, then the art, William Keith's paintings, the San Francisco Swedenborgian Church as a building, George Inness's paintings, Sarah Orne Jewett's work, etc., are not just a return to a wilderness mystique, but a form of invention, I would say, of practices which are engaged in forms of perception. And while they're based on one side on the Swedenborgian heritage, they also really re-articulate it in a new way. And I think this is really where, for me, the striking force of your own book lies, how you trace this transformation into what I would call a culture of sensibility. So it's also not the case that we could say it's a mystical re-enchantment of nature that we encounter, but something more complex in terms of what I just called a formation, or also an education, we could call it, of perception. Now, I have a few points, I don't want to talk much more, that I'm really interested in, and you mentioned, or it was mentioned when I was introduced, that I have a particular interest in the imagination as a term, as it played a role in medieval practices of meditation. Here it comes out as a term that is important for you, that is important in Swedenborg already, but that keeps its valence and its importance throughout, and that you then set also in relation to wonder, yeah, wonder, astonishment. And there again, I'd just like to ask if you want to talk about this a little bit more, how this speaks to you along the line that you just mentioned at the end, because you make rather marginally in the book, when there's a lot of work to do there and you're invested in that work, you establish this relation to modern art, from land art, Andy Goldsworthy, and others, to the example that I wasn't familiar with that you just discussed. And this investment in the imagination, or in a particular form of imagination that is open to correlations and correspondences, is something I find particularly fascinating. I already mentioned the movement in nature, which I found striking, yeah? That the feeling of deep time, as you say at some points in reference to recent work in that area, is actually a feeling, as you call it, and that is something that comes about, again, I would say, through a certain practice of relating to the world that is also mediated through community. And then I just wanted to bring you back to the question of the Christianity aspect, or the theological aspect that plays obviously a role throughout this work, and to the notion also of performing transcendence, which for me is a bit in a tension with what you call the immanental theology, which as a theology I understand, yeah, based on authors like Jacob Boehme and Swedenborg, and then Emerson and so on. But the performing transcendence seems to be evoking a little bit of a different framework, which again brings me back to the practice and to the investment of imagination and practice in this notion of transcendence that comes about in a certain form of awareness. So these are my words for now. I think I end here.
Thank you, Dr. Largier, for that in-depth and expansive response. I look forward to hearing Dr. Zuber's response to you. I now call on Dr. Joan Richardson. Could you please unmute?
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm delighted to be involved in this extended conversation about Devin's work that, for me, has obviously been going on for a very long time and has informed my spirit and my teaching for all the years since I've known Devin. And I want to say that he is embodying into the 21st century what it really means to have a Swedenborgian engagement with not only the natural world we inhabit on this planet, but with the universe as far as we can imagine it. I want to say that what Swedenborg is about and what Devin's work is about is describing and defining what is a secular scientific spirituality. That is, it's important to acknowledge what it means to have a spirit, which from its derivation from the Greek psyche, which is breath, which is the same root that informs nature in Greek, that we are participant in whatever it is that's going on in what to the extent that we can possibly imagine where we are in this great ever expanding situation in which we find ourselves. And I want to say that what Swedenborg manages to do in his work, and what Emerson picked up on profoundly, and what William James was able to continue through the work that his own father did on Swedenborg, was to understand that that Swedenborg was able to focus what it meant to focus qualities of attention entrained by things outside the human, by understanding that things are, he somehow understood in a profoundly Kantian sense that things are the same all the way up and all the way down. And so his imagination was able to engage in what Emerson calls habits of conversation with nature, to imagine that the habits, that is the habitus where we reside, can be extended as far as we possibly can imagine. And that the imagination for us as humans is intrinsically involved with how we use words and how we put those words together to make stories of one kind or another. So that Swedenborg, for example, was able to translate everything he knew about mineralogy into imagining, say, what that angelology that he creates is a translation of imagining what it would be to inhabit life on a planet that's like Mars now, with what we're expanding, with what we're exploring, like to reside in his imagination in that place, and to extend what life or being means to that engagement with a different set of elements altogether. So he could imagine, say, what angels were eating on other planets, or what angels were wearing on other planets. And those angels are not really angels, they're just messengers about extending the possibilities of imagination. Our problem right now in the way that we're living is the impossibility we find ourselves in of extending our imaginations to consider things not only outside the human, but even amongst ourselves as humans, so that we don't understand what it is to think about or to imagine other. Swedenborg was the primary, was like the grounding text in this in 19th century, for the 19th century Americans who understood that we found ourselves in a place with a language inherited from a small rocky island in the North Sea, unable to describe what we were seeing and feeling on this continent. So along comes Swedenborg, giving permission, as it were, through these worlds within worlds that he's creating in his cosmologies, to understand that we are truly part or particle of nature, understanding that nature itself, going back to its roots, means nothing else but being born, and that we're constantly being born again. And to to the nature of the re-enchantment of the world is to translate that understanding of nature into how we think about things. So, for example, a language of a language that establishes who we are in relationship to as far as we can understand. That is to understand that we need to find a grammar and a syntax to describe relations that we have not yet understood, but that we can understand through the way that we construct the stories that we tell. This understanding of relations, Swedenborg himself extending it to the worlds within worlds and outside of worlds in his angelology and cosmology, becomes kind of a groundwork for realizing that we need to find new ways of putting words together that would express, in William James's terms, say, the moments of transition that we experience all the time but don't register. So William James talks about what it would be to have a language that describes, say, a feeling of if, or a feeling of between, or a feeling of and, which we still don't have. But it was Swedenborg who pointed the way to all of that in focusing on the habitus, the habits that we have, expanding those habits to get out of the local, to extend the understanding of economy and ecology into, that is its root, ecology, economy, they come from the Greek root meaning family, that our family is not only the human, that it is everything that we can begin to imagine around us, and that we are connected to all of those things. So these extending spheres of relation is what he offers as possibility for ongoing work, and that all of those who have paid attention to what he is about have understood. And the nature of the engagement, Niklaus spoke about engagement and about attention. So the engagement involves, it's like you can only engage if you can get your gears in some kind of relation to a larger set of gears. So you have to find the mechanisms in language, because that's all we have, or the mathematical formula to do that. And so finally, I think the project that Swedenborg lays out in the 19th century becomes the groundwork for all of the experimental work in language that begins to get done after William James at the turn of the 20th century. We remember Gertrude Stein and all of the experiments and all of the things that continue to happen with experimental poetics and ways of using now, say, images in language as part of the hypertext that we create to expand the way that we understand the world in which we are. And that this is finally when the term Devin's aspiration for a speculative historiography, this is, I think, what lies, this aspiration, this description that I've tried to kind of sketch, is what lays behind this kind of aspiration that Devin has, and that he has begun to succeed at laying out. I don't know that I have anything more particular to say just now, but I'm just kind of throwing out these observations, hoping that they will offer hooks for engagement in a conversation that will continue.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. And now I want to invite Devin Zuber to respond.
Niklaus and Joan, thank you so much for the responses. Really an honor, a peak experience in my career up till this point to have those words. I want to keep my comments brief because the evening is short, and I would love to open up the floor broader to many of you who have come in and have questions for all of us, not just me about what was said. I really appreciate some of the convergence in both of these readings that paid attention to the particularities of language and in Swedenborg and his followers. And maybe I'll begin by a brief gloss on Niklaus's wonderful remark about embodiment, and to think of that, the habits of reading that become a habitus and a new mode of perception that this work inculcates and becomes part of an aesthetic practice. And in a way that relates to what I was trying to do with imagination. The word imagination, I think, is in some ways hard-baked into the field of eco-criticism, ecological literary criticism, from the ways that Lawrence Buell launches the American iteration of this field with his environmental imagination book on Thoreau. But I'm interested in something a little bit different. And if you've read that book by Buell, which is marvelous, there's actually very little about the imagination in it as a proleptic or function of perception and cognition. I'm interested in imaginaries and sort of social practices and ways of perception through the aesthetic that habituate larger new ways of viewing the world that hopefully have an implication and an effect in politics and the like. So I wish I thought about this more sensitively in some of the figures I trace, who are obviously inventing a genre of walking as a form of revelation and epiphany. And it's in the essay, but also I think an American variant on the essay as form that Thoreau in particular comes to the fore, where the walking is inextricable from a kind of diurnal writing and attention to the rhythms of the seasons in his body that are in tension with kind of the clock time of modernity. And in my book, I wish I talked about her more. I see this acutely in Sarah Orne Jewett, maybe even more so than Muir, even though we can pinpoint Muir and the Sierra Club and the history of sort of the Alpenverein in America that become the hiking clubs in the Sierra Club. But I think that regionalist aesthetic in New England that Jewett inherits from Thoreau and Emerson, fused through a Swedenborgian scrim, is a very interesting attention to place and a writing about folkways that opens up a very different kind of readerly experience than when you read the descriptions of Muir and his Disney-like cartwheeling through the Sierra Nevada. So I want to think about that more. Jewett as a body moving through space in Maine and elsewhere, reading her Swedenborg and her Emerson outdoors. Secular scientific spirituality. I think that's a wonderful term that Joan provided that also answers some of what Niklaus addressed in terms of the ways that, while on the one hand, Swedenborg continues a form of Protestant interiorization and mysticism that Jakob Böhme and others also exemplify, that mediate Neoplatonic forms of flows and emanations into nature, into an experience of nature. But the writing is so different, fundamentally in all ways, on the surface and at a deeper level of content. And I think that has to do with the empirical pressure put on Swedenborg as a man of his moment in the 18th century, and sort of a working through the after effects of Locke and Lockean notions of language that lead to a writing style that in some ways is the antithesis of the aphoristic, opaque, rich, lush imagery you find in Burma. There's no immediate poetry in Swedenborg. It requires a different kind of approach that becomes a mode of perception. And I think that comes out of the training as science. And I could say a lot more about imagination, but I think if anything, what we're living through as a planet, as a culture in our United States context is a crisis of imagination, a failure to teach the imagination at all levels of our educational projects. So what is one to do? How do you teach new modes of seeing, new modes of reading, and perceiving? This is something I'm hoping my book somewhat indirectly addresses, even though it's focused on the 19th century.
Is it,
Yeah.
can we talk together as you're talking?
Yes. Yeah.
So I just want to say about imagination that, and our moment, that imagination requires, as Swedenborg and Emerson reiterated in his piece on Emerson, on Swedenborg, it requires being alone, quiet, and closing your eyes. That is, the imagination is involved with an individual's experience and having sense through walking or being attuned to and paying attention to rhythm, the translation of those impulses into her or his own translation of what that means. And in the culture that we inhabit now, we are we're under constant barrage of images that are not images, that are mediated by things that have nothing to do with an individual's relationship to an environment. And that is a serious, serious, serious problem that needs to be corrected. I don't know how. Anyway.
Excellent. Niklaus, did you want to say something?
Yeah,
there?
I couldn't agree more. It's an addiction, I would even call it, when it produces that addiction. Yeah, think of TikTok, if you ever looked at it. It pulls you in with senselessly. But I want to go. You in talking about imagination, you talked also about imaginaries. And I think, just to get back to the book, I think, imagination is a very big term, abstract, for whatever we imagine it to be. But imaginaries that are being developed, and possibly, as Jones says, in that somewhat individual exercise, but open to sharing, let's put it that way. And you, in a way, you see it so nicely in your presentation of these, also the particular figures. You can start with Swedenborg himself and the travels to planets, everything that comes into play there, the angels. So you can talk about it with Thoreau in a specific way, with Whitman, with Emerson, all the figures, and they would go up to the 20th century. But the big problem is the problem we all deal with is that what Eckhart would have called, it's all alien images that have flooded our imagination. That's the context where he coins the term detachment. It is to get rid of the alien images, as he calls it. It's a very kind of you could reformulate it in a very modern way immediately there. And it has to do with the imagination and the way to also inhabit the imaginary that comes about in that situatedness of a practice, of a doing. So where it's not the abstract imagination, but the imagination very concretely forming something. And the term you use there is the ray of relation. I think it's a Swedenborgian, or you use it with regard to or Emerson, or I forgot where, but that comes about in that. It's not something that is external, but it's something that comes about. So it has this ethical dimension.
I want to open up the floor. I just want to make an announcement that the floor is open for questions. And so if any of you have questions, comments, please put them in the chat box, and I'll moderate them. And you can actually address them to Dr. Zuber or to either of our respondents. Please go on.
Thank you. Well, maybe give a brief response here. I think it's interesting to think about as we acknowledge the acuteness of our visual regime of modernity. Here we are stuck on these screens, and I've not been seduced by TikTok, but I've watched its effects on my oldest daughter, and having to control and navigate that. But just to go back to the 19th century and recall how this arc that I'm tracing of engagements with Swedenborg take place in what some have called a visual frenzy of 19th century cultures, and just rapid advancements in the reproduction of images and image technology, the daguerreotype to the photograph, printed media. And I think that the transcendentalist reception of Swedenborg through Emerson is acutely ocular because of the ways in which, and this is where Emerson tropes incessantly on mystic, the closing of the eyes to the outside world for an experience within. And many of the figurations of his language about Swedenborg follow an optic register about eyes. And this is, I think in the English romantic tradition, of course, has a progeny, Milton, Blake, where that equation with blindness and insight carries a lot of force. But Swedenborg amplifies and then popularizes. One thing my book does not do, because I'm trained in literary criticism, I come from a good place. I did not give much attention to the popular diffusion of these tropes within, say, something like phrenology or mesmerism, all the isms that follow the spiritualist wave, where Swedenborg's scientific rhetoric becomes modified and adapted to provide an alternative to mind-body relations that are a sort of a lodestar in 19th century culture. I think we see this acutely in Whitman, who I wish I could have squeezed into the book, but it just didn't quite fit. In a way, I think what Jane Bennett has done in her newest book, which is titled after a Swedenborgian moment in Whitman's poetry, influx and efflux. That line comes directly from Whitman's reading, where you see a more popular form of engagement with Swedenborg there. So the imagination, even though in English we wrestle with the image there, there's hardwired into it a curious oxymoron that comes out of religious practice that Swedenborg too.
Yeah.
We have a question. Sorry. Joan, do you want to go ahead?
I just want to just drop in the reminder that Emerson offers about the nature of imagination, that it is the identification of whatever it is that we consider ourselves to be with something else. That is the complete internal, like imagination is, for example, imagining what a neutrino is doing as it's going through with all of the other billions through my hand at, how many, like, what is that? But that is real. And what is that? And to just stay quiet for a long enough time to imagine where those neutrinos are coming from and what they're doing is what imagination is. It has nothing to do with presenting a physical image as a daguerreotype or a photograph. It has to do with understanding a process of influx and efflux. It is a digestion, it's a process. It is remembering that energy means nothing else but transform. So
Yeah.
transform that information into an understanding of where you are in this great, impossible to imagine fully situation. But we do have the limited, we have a spectrum on the visual spectrum of like the space of a dime compared to the width of the United States. Our capacities in terms of our senses as human beings are extremely, extremely, extremely limited. Nonetheless, we have access with the additions of the instruments that we have created, including language, accesses to worlds within worlds or worlds beyond us, like what's going on in Mars now, that they made oxygen on Mars today. I mean, we have done that with language.
Yeah.
That has happened with whether it's mathematical language or chemical language, or it happens through language. And that's what Swedenborg understood.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So-
I think that's very important to remember. It's sort of moving language beyond a strictly denotative descriptor context tied to the words we used. I'm thinking of a line from Wallace Stevens that I first heard in the seminar you taught, Joan, that it must be abstract, a line that he returns to. And I think it's about the ability to represent something, not the thing itself, whether that's through higher math or hieroglyphics. Swedenborg, of course, his theory of correspondence comes out of his deep interest in how can we think about complex relations in reality through forms of icons and indices, to use.
And your understanding of his relationship to Persis semiotic and kind of a precursor to Persis semiotic. I mean, all of that is extremely significant. It needs to be broken out more and more into continuing with your followers.
So Joan essentially answered the question. The question was, from where does our imagination originate? But I have another question that's longer. Let me read this to you. It says, quote, it's in quotes. So, thinking doesn't hold a candle to the feeling body. End quote. To have the time, peace, temporal and physical space to develop imagination and imaginaries are diminished not only by certain relations to social media, but also by the economic systems in which we are enmeshed, which have despoiled flora-fauna communities on a planetary level. What can help us break out of this cage of, quote, necessities, religious belief, naked fear on a societal level, naked demonstrations of love, solidarity, again, on a societal level? This is from Leah Park.
Leah, thanks for the question. I know Leah, that's wonderful. Very deep. Although I can say, after having lived in the Bay Area for 10 years, when I see the phrase naked demonstrations, I think immediately of, our Beta Breakers race, which involves a lot of naked demonstration. Well, I think this is more something Joan could comment on, because it's been the focus of several of her books. The way that this line of American thought that is so in deep dialogue with Swedenborg is trying to annul the divorce between intellect and feeling. And Joan's work here was really important for my language of things on the fact of feeling, that American pragmatism that builds on the work of Emerson and these readings of Swedenborg were trying to locate the way embodied as a cognitive affect thought actually is, and that this comes out of the way we've evolved as a species on the planet. And I think that's a great question from Leah, because it goes back to Niklaus's remark about imagination, which how do I relate that in my book to wonder and awe, and sort of these things I'm holding up as something that comes out of the romantic enchantment with Swedenborg. So I'd love to maybe hear Joan or Niklaus talk about that, but I see, yeah.
Let me just say immediately that one of the things I had wanted to note earlier, that the title of A Language of Things rather than The Language of Things is very important, because it underscores the reality that it is the relation of an individual, any individual in a particular, any individual is simply a vector on a time-space scale. You're a point on a planet at a particular moment. And so whatever you're going to express about your experience has to be generated as part of that momentary extended relation that you have had in your time space. And this is something that Swedenborg understood and that Devin understands, and that needs to be underscored, and that each of us has the privilege of being able to describe that relation if one takes enough time to cultivate, really, again, habits of conversation with nature. Take a walk in the woods, spend as many hours on your own walking quietly. It doesn't matter whether it's a sidewalk or the woods, but away from media, to hear your own thoughts as you're walking and what's coming in. Anyway, yeah.
It's not just to add, it's not just the medium. It's, you said time and cultivate. I must confess, I actually got to like the pandemic in that sense, insofar as it really interrupted this highly functionalized existence. Even at the university, as we know it, with this specific emphasis, just this whole, to be very political here, this whole late capitalist world that we inhabit, where everything has to be functionalized. Sports, what you do this. Everything is also has to be work, working out, working this. So it's to be very pathos.
That little book of Zizek's, Pandemic, where he talks about this being a time of pause and of privilege to be able to, not that I'm a big fan of Zizek generally, but that book was useful.
And in this privileged position, I must add, of somebody who has a job and gets the salary and can be at home. It's obviously very privileged.
We have one more question as our time is running out. I'll just put that in there. This is from Mimi Winnick. It says, it seems like your method in your work is attuned to effects of awe and wonder at art, literature, even history at the same time. You mention more cautiously the lure of certain imperial models of natural beauty, as in some of the paintings of the West of the Lost Eden. In your own methods, how do you balance attending to awe and wonder and being critical and wary of such lures at the same time?
Mimi, I'm so glad you're here. I can't see you on the Zoom chat, but thanks so much for chiming in. It's really wonderful for people I haven't seen in a long time to be coming into this Zoom chat in different time zones. I don't have time to go fully into this because I know we're reaching the end of our span we had set into place. Lure is a complicated word. And when I use lure, I sometimes have in mind the work of Ray Chow and others, or Donna Haraway, where it comes actually out of sort of quantum physics and thinking about how matter and particles are put together. But I think in my talk, I gave it a more negative cast there in terms of the seduction of naturalizing a mode of perceiving nature via the panoramic or the picturesque, and thinking that there's a there, and not actually an acculturated history of techniques of viewing, techniques of the observer, and framed by pictorial practices, right? I think without getting into the politics of land and the questions of indigeneity I was raising, I think the temptation you see across all of our culture, where when we might be moved into a certain affect by a landscape, let's say, is it Instagrammable? Am I going to use my camera to frame it in such a way? And perhaps rather it's the non-productivity of the moment, to go back to these wonderful remarks about the pandemic and time and walking in nature wherever is I think a genuine aesthetic experience is precisely a kind of unproductivity. It doesn't immediately give you the beautiful selfie with you on the mountaintop, or it doesn't become a fixed image. It's a living thing inside you that you've ingested through the aesthetic. So how do we be cautious and leery of lures? I think maybe being attuned to the cultural lenses we've inherited that push moments of perception into a sort of fixedness. And also, I think my book was tremendously enhanced. I don't know if she's here. I mentioned her in my talk, but some of my wonderful students at the GTU who read early drafts of this book and helped raise really important critiques and questions about landscape in the West. And I see this as sort of a growing edge for me with my work forward on aesthetics and the West is to keep that dialectic open and always think about the indigenous aesthetics that come out of those experiences too. So maybe enough there. I don't know if we have to move towards wrapping up, Rita, because we are.
Yes. I'm afraid we do. Thank you very much, Devin, and thank you for the gift of your wonderful volume, and much appreciation to Niklaus, Largier, and to Joan Richardson, and to all of you who have attended this talk and the launch of A Language of Things, a remarkable book.
A Language of Things.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Joan and Niklaus. Many.
Thank you for the occasion. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nice.
Be well, all. Have a good night.
Be well. Yeah.
Bye.
Good one. Bye.
Bye.